Today we're going to learn about a new topic called ecological succession. So what is ecological succession? Succession is just a term that scientists use for a series of predictable changes that occur in a community over time. So I like to think of this as how an ecosystem grows, right? So we might start off with a small field, we grow into a bunch of small bushes, and eventually it grows up to be a big forest. Succession is the series of stages that an ecosystem will go through to kind of get to its end, what it looks like, whether it's a jungle, a desert, or a forest. These are the steps that it goes through. And there's basically kind of two types of succession. We call them primary and secondary. And they both look very similar, and there's just kind of one major difference between the two. So we're going to start with primary here. Primary succession is succession or ecosystem growth that occurs in an area where there are no organisms and no soil. So this is an area that might have nothing but bare rock. You could think of this as an ecosystem that's growing from the very start. Primary succession doesn't happen too often because there are very few areas where things grow where there's no soil. In fact, for almost any ecosystem to exist, you need soil. There needs to be some place for the plants to grow and to get their water and nutrients from. So no soil usually means that there's going to be no growth. First thing is, where does this occur? Why might there be an area with no living organisms and no soil? And the answer is always going to be natural disasters, and specifically in primary succession, it's going to be caused by a volcano. That's actually the only instance I can think of where primary succession might happen today, because everything else either has soil or doesn't support living organisms, like a parking lot doesn't support living organisms. That has no organisms and no soil, but nothing's really going to grow there. But a volcano is a perfect example of this. You might have, living organisms in dirt, but once that volcano erupts and that magma washes down, you're going to have a blank slate, just basically rock. And from there, we can slowly build up an ecosystem. Now, the question is, if there's no soil, how does anything grow? So if a volcano erupts in Hawaii, say, and just tars over the whole place with magma and rock, how is an ecosystem going to grow there if there's no dirt? How are you going to have plants that can then provide food for smaller mammals and things like that? It's actually quite interesting. There's a series of organisms called pioneer species, and they get their name because they're always the first to grow in an area where there's no soil. And the best example of a pioneer species is these things on the rock here called lichens. They're actually a series of two organisms that live together, an algae and a fungus. But these lichens are capable of growing on rocks. They can photosynthesize, so they can make their own sugar, they can make their own food, so they don't need anything from the rock. Actually, they just use it as a place to live. And they can actually get all the moisture and water they need just from the air. It's very similar kind of like to the algae that can grow on the side of buildings. So these lichens are able to grow on rocks where there's no soil. And over time, these lichens kind of live and they die and they decay and they kind of build up in the area around. And actually, as these lichens live on the rock, they excrete like these enzymes that can help break down the rock and help turn that into dirt. So over time, these lichens will keep growing on these rocks. They'll keep dying, and they're going to kind of build up down here. This is going to take hundreds and thousands of years for them to create a small little patch of soil. But once they create that small little patch of soil from dying and building up and breaking down the rock, eventually there's going to be enough soil for other organisms to move in. So this is a lichen. It's going to break down the rock and create the soil for other organisms to live in or move in. And then from there, once you have soil, you can have other organisms move in like grass, small bushes. They can use that soil to grow. And what's going to happen is every organism that moves in changes the environment a little bit. So the lichens provide the soil. Maybe those bushes move in and they make berries, and the berries allow squirrels to come in. And once there's squirrels, you can have foxes. Every organism that comes in changes the environment a little bit, and that allows other species to move in. And that community is going to keep growing until it reaches what we call the climax community, which is just kind of the stable end stage of succession. So it's when the ecosystem stops changing and all the organisms that are there kind of stay there. So if you think about this big forest, well, if I was to come back to this forest maybe 100, 200 years from now, it would look pretty much the same type of organisms, big trees, small bushes on the ground, lots of leaves, squirrels. And that ecosystem stays like that until something happens to it. But basically, it stops growing. We call that the climax community. It's the end stages. You can see this. This is a perfect example. An old growth forest, it'll just stay like that for hundreds and hundreds of years. So you can see in a timetable, it looks something like this. Remember, primary succession. We're always going to start off in an area with no soil, so it's always going to start off with bare rock. If I show you a diagram on a test and you see that diagram starts off with bare rock, you know it's primary succession because there's no soil. And then here's your pioneer species like the lichens and the mosses that are going to help build up the soil for other organisms like grasses and shrubs to move in. And eventually it's going to turn into a forest, and that's your climax community, and that's going to stop. And again, hundreds and thousands of years for this to occur. This process is very slow, but over time you're going to end up with your climax community, a big forest. There's your bare rock community. Now let's take a look at the other type of succession called secondary. And the good thing is once we've learned about primary, secondary succession is the same. It's actually exactly the same, except there's already soil in place. So we don't need those pioneer species to break down rock. We don't need them to make the soil. So the question is, well, how do we get areas that have no living organisms there, no plants, no animals, but only soil? Why would you have an area with soil but no living things? And the same answers as natural disasters, just different types. If you think about natural disasters that could, remove remove living organisms but keep the soil, I always say things like floods, storms, forest fires are a great example. This fire would come through the forest. It would kill all the animals. It will kill all the plants and trees, and all the shrubs would burn. But what you're left with, the soil is still there. So an ecosystem can grow right back into that soil. That dirt will provide the area for regrowth, if you will. So in secondary succession, it looks something like this. You might have a natural disaster. Your soil's still there, so your plants and shrubs and bushes and grasses can move in right away. We don't have to wait for the lichens to break down rocks into soil. And then again, it's going to turn into your climax community. It's going to go through that stage where every organism that moves in changes it a little bit to allow the next group of organisms to move in, and the next group of organisms to move in, so forth and so on. Now, if you compare the two, primary succession to secondary succession, you can see they're both different in that primary succession, there's no soil. We require pioneer species to make that soil, and it's very slow. Versus secondary succession, which happens a lot faster because the soil is already present. But both are going to result in a climax community. And this is an important point. No matter kind of what you start with, you always end up with the same climax community. Your community, the ecosystem that grows there, whether it's a rainforest or a jungle, is controlled by the climate. So if I went into a local forest here and I cut it down, I burned it down, and I let it regrow through secondary succession, it's not going to turn into something different. It's not going to grow up this time and be a desert, or grow up this time and be a rainforest. It'll grow into the exact same forest that it was before. It'll just take time as it has to regrow, but it'll have the same types of plants because those are all controlled by the climate. It'll grow back into the same exact ecosystem.